So you got it, but oh.
There you go.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Anand Akela. I am a DevOps Summit Chair and a faculty speaking here every year since the first year of Cloud Expo and DevOps Summit. So for the power panel today, and I'll let my panelists introduce themselves in a few minutes, but let me start with the goal we have for our discussion today is where DevOps heading. We are 10 now. DevOps is 10. In 2009, if you know the DevOps history, Paul Hammond and John Apsow of Flickr, they had a very nice conversation between development, engineering, and operations, and their collaboration at Velocity Summit 2009. And then later on, Peter Dubuis, he started DevOps Days kind of towards the end of the year in Belgium. And that's when kind of the DevOps, the word was coined. And since then, as you know, the Phoenix Project came, multiple of books, a lot of different discussions have started. At DevOps Summit at Cloud Expo, we have been talking about it for at least 8 years. And I remember when Andy Mann was chair for the first time, 5 years ago, he had a power panel exactly like this, and he called it DevOps at 5, what's next? So I actually was inspired by that, and I said, okay, DevOps is 10, where are we? If some of the things that they talked about, did that really happen? And where are we going? So that's the kind of the crux, that's what we'll be talking about. But before we do that, let me request my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Bhanu.
Hey, thank you, Anand. My name is Bhanu Singh. I lead the engineering and DevOps operation in a startup OpsRamp. We have a booth here at 409. And we have been building products to manage operation management, IT hybrid cloud operation management across enterprise and for MSPs, applying machine learning, algorithmic technologies out there, AI ops, in order to drive and bring value that enterprises are looking to manage their hybrid world that is kind of becoming very complex. And we are running our engineering through DevOps pipeline or DevOps chain. And as a small organization which is trying to get to a hyperscale startup, we are seeing how to take the DevOps challenge to the next level. When you have a global team from 20 to 200, what does it mean? And how do you keep the momentum that you can do with the smaller teams as you grow and as you become more heterogeneous in nature?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. My name is Scott Harvey. I am the VP of Engineering and Operations at Atmosera. And Atmosera really is a managed service provider, and we're focused on the Microsoft stack. So when we have things both on-prem and actually in the hyperscaler cloud, we're really helping our clients on the journey. And sometimes that includes helping them on the journey of DevOps as well. And when we take over and help them with their on-prem infrastructure and migrate it to hyperscaler, or whether we leave it on-prem and have this education, so to speak, of clients in what technologies they need to use, it really is important that we have some base level understanding of what DevOps is. And certainly we talk a little bit about what DevOps means, and we'll get more into it, I'm sure, here today. But that journey is really the important part for our clients. So happy to be here.
Greg?
My name is Greg Bledsoe. It's an honor to be here. Very pleased and honored to be invited to take part. And I spent a number of years as a consultant, joined the Accenture DevOps Enterprise Architecture group, and went from there, joined up with Solutions IQ, the Agile Transformation Specialists, and helped transform the human portion of the organization. Because there really is no technical system, there's a human system layered itself into technology. Which is the real key I discovered and why I wanted to work in the human system more than the technical system, because that's where the real impact is. And lately I'm with M3 Consulting, and we're specializing right now in running an emerging talent program to help get fresh faces into global enterprises to help them in their own transformation efforts.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So you can see that we have an amazing panel with a lot of expertise and best practices that they will share in the next 40 minutes or so. But before we go and talk about what DevOps will be in its teens or in next decades, let's kind of recap where we are. And as you know, like DevOps word could be like an elephant in a room. People looking from different direction could feel it a little bit different. So let's just kind of set the ground straight. And let me ask the panelists, what do they mean by DevOps? What's the definition, or what's the kind of areas that they're covering? Let's start with you, Greg.
Sure. So what's funny is I actually, at DevOps Enterprise Summit in Vegas in 2018, posed this question to Gene Kim, who famously changes his definition every year, and said, if a word means everything, it doesn't mean anything. So we have to figure out, what does DevOps not include? Not only what does it include, but what does it exclude? That's the real definition, is what is it not? And so his new definition is really about the outcomes, achieving faster delivery, less waste, higher quality. And my own evolving definition, which I think I've settled down to, is DevOps really fundamentally, when you come down to it, is the realignment of IT around business value. And I think when you start realizing that we haven't traditionally aligned our IT around business value, we've really aligned it around cost control and resource efficiency. When you realize the dichotomy between the effects and incentives produced, I think then you start to really fundamentally understand why DevOps is powerful and why it is revolutionary. That's
great. And that's right. I mean, DevOps, there has been a lot of different extension. DevSecOps, at AppDynamics, we call it BizDevOps, all different DocOps, and all different kind of extension of DevOps we have seen, and it is extending. And we'll talk more about the evolution of that. And as you said, Greg, that the whole idea is faster delivery at better quality. We focused in the last many years on faster delivery. Quality was become a bottleneck, and that's where I spent some time, and we can talk more about that area. But Scott, what's your definition?
Sure, and I agree. The outcomes are what it should be about, no question. But when you start talking to people that don't have an idea of what it is and how then it applies to their business, you have to kind of boil it down. And unfortunately, it does mean different things to different people. So, very generically, it's the DevOps movement. You got development married with operations, and they're pushing product or pushing infrastructure or pushing something out the door faster. So I think it is about that. And marrying that to, and we'll get into this later, some governance activity and security activity, we really have to look at that and how that plays with the overarching deployment structure of what application or infrastructure we're trying to get out there.
Bhanu?
I tell my team, DevOps is the flow of code to cache. How quickly you get a code to cache. And that means, how does the different, like all the way building the software, testing, deploying, monitoring and managing the whole life cycle. That's pretty much DevOps. If you take the wiki definition, it says how the development and operations collaborate, how often and how early they collaborate to deliver something right. But it's all about, how do you deliver something right, and how do you manage the risk, and how the people who are building the applications are running the application. So for me, the DevOps is a way of doing things to make software less risky, more manageable, and fast to reach the outcome that Greg and Scott highlighted.
That's great. It's if you have read, and I think many of you may have followed the State of DevOps report that Nicole and others came up with. They have a term called lead time, from starting of code to delivery, and that's definitely one of the key metrics. And I'll talk more about metrics here, but one of the things that I believe that in DevOps, quality, and I had a talk this morning on this topic, one of the important things of DevOps is that you should be able to answer one question does this release candidate has acceptable level of risk? Once you have the answer to that, you have all different technologies and processes and culture changes for accelerating the software delivery, but are they ready to deploy in production? Do they have all the information that allows them to make the decision in a really a quantitative way? That's a key, and that's one of the things that DevOps, as we mature, need to focus on: business risk and evaluation of business risk, and depending on that, deciding whether this release candidate is really ready for prime time.
Well, this goes all the way back to extreme programming that was released in 1996, right?
Yeah.
It was really it was such a marketing mistake to call it extreme programming, in my opinion, because all these organizations were like, we don't want to be extreme. What we really want to do is manage risk, and the actual methodology that's introduced in extreme programming is all about minimizing your risk by shrinking your batch size, by doing the minimum thing you need to do, and making small iterative consecutive changes instead of batching up a bunch of sometimes unrelated changes. That is a way to manage risk. And so when you start thinking about how do we maximize the value we deliver while minimizing risk, there's all of these kind of follow-on methodologies that come with it, like minimizing batch size, like continuous testing, like continuous integration, right? What's the fastest feedback we can get to the developer? Does it build, right? Did you break the build, right? That was the whole thing, right? When we first got dev and ops in the room, we could tell, instead of just throwing it back over the wall to the dev and saying, your stuff doesn't build, fix it, and the dev has no idea what's wrong because it works on my laptop, syndrome was in full effect. We go over and we show them why. We show the developers why it didn't work. And then they don't make that mistake again. And then you gradually increase the reliability of your whole process that way. And then we thought, we'll just keep doing that. We'll just keep expanding the set of things we're including in this. And then we started getting that programmatic view from the developers, where they're like, well, we could just automate that. You could just have a build server that just automatically runs the build and then sends us an email and lets us know. And we just kept iterating on that and kept iterating on that. And we realized eventually that what we're actually doing is implementing lean thinking for software delivery, which is why now we include culture automation, lean measurement sharing. I think that it's so profound to understand that what you're really trying to do is minimize risk and maximize value.
Completely agree with you. One more thing before we talk about kind of future. How do you measure the success of DevOps? We have been doing it for the last 10 years. A lot of organizations are investing in it. People are learning about it. There are schools and organizations teaching about it. There are practices that are kind of making a lot of services and consulting dollars out of it. But how do you measure the success? We talked about one metric, the lead time, right? But what are the other metrics that you have seen that you could say that kind of measures the success of DevOps? Start with you, Banu.
With me, one thing that I look at, because Greg mentioned about lean, and I did a complete value stream mapping for my entire, where we are spending time, even in a shorter release cycle. And one thing we found, the rework. In software, we kind of, you release, it works, but it doesn't meet the exact outcome.
Right.
So there's nothing failed, but it didn't meet what exactly the customer wanted. So you do rework again, and you're doing another release. So how do you really do things right so that you minimize the rework? So one, because this is what the benefit of DevOps, the lead time, the flow, but also the feedback, left to right, right to left. How do you get right to left fast so that you can learn quickly? And so one of the measurement we are doing, how much rework, that is the waste that we keep doing. We should have done it first time, but we are doing it again, which means you are wasting resource.
Very good.
So how do you cut down that? And another one we measure is failed changes, like how many failed changes you are making into the system.
So deployed, the changes that you made.
That got deployed, but it really didn't. It's a simple change, a bug fix. It fixed it, but it also caused a regression. So that's a failed change. So that means the success, it fixed one bug, but your continuous automation, continuous testing didn't catch something else. So those we measure along with the flow definitely is the one how fast you are.
Right.
But those comes back and bites your flow.
Right.
If you are not careful, that impact of the change and the downstream, and those are the two we measure.
Scott?
And playing onto that, obviously success, how many successful releases you've had is super important, and that should be tracked in all cases. But going back to the failed release, when you have that failed release and you have that problem, where did the test case miss it? What can we go and do and fix? And do test-driven development. What broke or that should have broke that didn't break when we were looking at that. So I really also look at the number of test cases and the kind of coverage you do get in features. You're just a very rote measurement of, okay, this feature check, this feature check, this feature check. And you can also go through code analysis as well for software and understand what test cases are going through and what code they're actually covering. So you get your high execution order stuff taken care of, meaning your yes path should be tested 100%, and you should always test the no paths as well, but less risky to not test those, more risky to not test the yes path. So certainly code coverage is what I would look at as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we've covered on some really good ones, right? We're working towards those outcomes. I mean, are we decreasing our cycle time from concept to cache? Are we having less bugs found in production? Right? That's the measures of things like how is our testing? How is our release cycle? Are we accomplishing the value for which we're adopting these practices? There's other ones you definitely want to look at, but I think the key concept is that you're taking the outcome that you're after and you're figuring out how to see if you're actually accomplishing that. Now, the ultimate outcome that we're trying to accomplish is to maximize value. And so measuring the value of what we did is very important. It's the hardest thing to measure. It's the hardest thing to quantify, and yet it's the most valuable thing to quantify. It is valuable to quantify the value of what you did, but it's also very difficult. So if you did 100,000 releases, if you've got your transaction cost in your system down to 0, you can release infinitely fast an infinite number of times forever, but yet you're not actually capturing any value in the market, then it's all waste. So I think the most neglected thing we're doing is to go back and figure out, are we actually accomplishing our mission as an organization?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Makes sense. All right, so now that we kind of talked about, recapped where are we at, with DevOps, what we mean by DevOps, let's talk about the challenges that we see so that we can kind of work on where it should evolve. So why don't we start with you, Scott, this time?
Sure.
What are the different challenges that you see with DevOps today? And let's kind of stop there, and we'll talk about evolution in a future discussion.
So much so fast. You can release stuff so quickly. You can turn infrastructure up, and in the hyperscaler cloud, the meters are running. So it's great to turn it all up. It's great to make sure that we can get it done. But when you have no governance on top of what developers and the operations team are doing, you can really get yourself in trouble in terms of recurring costs on that. So what I think is the gap today is adding a governance portion to what DevOps is today and making sure that when we're actually deploying these things for test or production or any other purpose, that we're reusing a lot of the technologies that we've already had and that we're using them very wisely in terms of our dollars spent, because we can get to the point that we're just deploying a whole lot of infrastructure and it's not doing a whole lot of good to anybody other than costing a lot of money.
Greg?
So I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think where governance comes in and how you work governance into your process, whenever you are surprised, someone somewhere in the process is surprised by something like cost or work arrives that was not expected and is disruptive, that's a sign that there's something you're not capturing to the left in the process. And so there's your opportunity to shift left and put in some either automated control or some constraint to reduce that downstream surprise. And I think that's sort of the evolving governance that we've got to be conscious that we need to move towards, right? I mean, constraints, we forget that constraints are actually a very important part of this system. It is all about empowerment, and it is about freedom, and it is about capturing the outcome by whatever means that you do, but it is not effective to do that in all possible ways. You have to constrain it down to the most effective ways in our environment for our people and set some constraints in place so that not everybody has to reinvent the wheel every day. And we're eliminating that downstream surprise. So the purpose of governance, I think we don't think deeply about what is the actual purpose of our governance and how can we distribute that governance through the process rather than having some overarching attempt to bolt things on at the end. Because that's what we already know doesn't work, that DevOps is really about turning that whole paradigm upside down and front-loading all that work so that those questions are answered before we actually enter into the pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I think that DevOps, we called it DevOps in the early days when John and Peter, Patrick, they talked about development and operations. They talked about collaboration between these two. But as we moved on in last many years, it felt like that we focused primarily on the developer side. Started with the stories, tests to some extent, build processes, repositories, the JFrogs of the world, and then release automation. And most of the definitions of DevOps, if you ask people, it's kind of stopped at release automation portion. Ops were always kind of talked about, but not really kind of connected and so it was like more kind of giving the operational responsibilities to developers, but not really a collaboration, not really like getting the information, the troubleshooting information and passing it back as a feedback. So that part of automation, in my opinion, is still missing. And the reason I kind of came before you is I know that you are kind of working on ops ramp, and do you have a point of view there that that part is missing, and what do you see as actual challenges there?
You're absolutely correct, Anand. I think I call it human scalability, right? Because DevOps really became very successful because developer took the ownership, right? And when you have a small organization, Silicon Valley, we think the whole world operates like Silicon Valley, right? With the fast-paced speed, adopting the next cool technology and trying to solve the next innovation or the next problem. But as you scale the organization from 20 to 200 people, and you start looking at, in a hybrid world, or you are bringing more legacy monolithic application while you are trying to build all native and microservices and containers, you need 3 different verticals, and they need to work together. And I call them like, you have a developer, which is your core engineering problem solvers. You have SREs, Google gave the SRE, Netflix called them core. These are the reliability people who are thinking and bringing a centralization of thinking around automation, thinking around scale, thinking around performance, thinking around heterogeneity. And you have the operation people who are thinking about how do I make a standard centralized operation, how the best use of storage and operation and caching and network. And I believe we are still missing that because developers have taken over, but they have really not understood what it means to really run a complex operation when it is not running in somebody's past environment. If you are running entire application on Force.com, that's great. But if you are trying to run an enterprise, global enterprise, and you're trying to run your application across multi-cloud environment in a hybrid environment, I think you need those three disciplines, I would say. They could be the same people, or they could be different people with different mindset to be working together in order to bring DevOps or scale the DevOps from 20 to 2000.
Makes sense. Kind of building off of that, and we are talking about the challenges. Do you see the challenges different when it comes to startups? You kind of touched on it, but startup SMBs, matured SMBs versus large enterprises. I'll tell you my personal experience working with large enterprises. They have SAP, right? The SAP release cycle is still, until they really move to SAP S/4HANA. Deadline for that is 2025, Their release cycle is still yearly release cycle. So you have your front-end applications, they are trying to kind of go follow DevOps processes, but when it comes to their back end, they have no way to kind of really do that. And so end-to-end process changes are difficult in large enterprises. So I want to kind of get your point of view on, do you see the challenges different in greenfield startups, SMBs versus enterprise DevOps that Gene Kim and team kind of named as unicorn versus horses, right? You had seen those discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's far easier to take a startup with a greenfield application that's got a team of developers that typically are engineers and typically in the mindset to solve problems and make that work. It's far more difficult to take an existing organization that has operational assets as well as developer assets and try and merge those two together to get the same outcome. Because fundamentally, the difference between engineers and operators are operators would like to have procedures. They want SOPs, they want runbooks. They want to make it repeatable and scalable the entire time. Not to say that developers don't, but operators typically aren't looking to solve the same problems that developers are. So you take a developer and now they're suddenly, oh, well, they'll jump into the operator's land because they're just geared to solve problems. They'll go figure out how the array works. They'll go figure out how the networking gear works. They'll go figure out how all this stuff works because that's what they do. Whereas an operator will go and read the manuals and make sure they understand how to configure and make all this stuff work together. And sure, that works as well. But that's where we still have this dichotomy and push and pull. And looking at organizations that are mature, and certainly an enterprise would be a mature organization, but even small and mid-sized business that have a mature process by which they currently operate, that's not DevOps, it is super difficult to try and introduce the terminology, to introduce the concepts, and get a lot of pull-through in that as well. So it's super hard.
Greg?
So I think you've just hit on two of the stickiest problems that enterprise organizations face in trying to transform into organizations that are capable of delivering more continually, to implement feedback loops, to move to new methodologies, any new methodology, because they have this tremendous amount of inertia behind the way they do it now. The culture is set in terms of everybody knows these are the ways we do and do not do things around here. And those are the unwritten rules that are unconsciously absorbed that people don't even know it's the box that they're in.
Right.
So cracking open that box is the real sticky problem. To take the implicit and make it explicit so we all understand why we did it this way, why we all accepted it, and now why we don't do it this way anymore. This is a tremendous leadership challenge because leaders can become very disconnected from what the actual incentives the organization has created at the base level, of the people actually on the ground doing the work. So the leader can think that this thing is all going swimmingly and be very surprised to discover that all the people on the ground doing the work think this is terrible and we're not actually changing anything, we're just changing how we're describing it. Yeah, we use Jenkins now to make builds, but everybody does everything manually. It's a series of manual actions still. And the automation piece isn't there because we've organized in silos. And each silo is only responsible for this set of the problem.
That's right.
Right? So DevOps is really about the interconnections between those silos. So who has the incentive to make sure that interconnection is smooth and works well? Reorienting the incentive structure of the organization so that not only does someone have the ownership of what falls through the cracks, but everyone has incentive to own that and align towards the outcome that we want. Right? Ops person doesn't care if there are bugs. Ops person only cares that the system is up.
Right.
What am I going to get yelled at for? What am I going to get promoted for? What's going to cost me my raise? These are the incentives that the person operating in the organization is actually worrying about. Not, are we delivering on our mission? Are we capturing the value in the market? So Deming's whole insight in breaking down the barriers between departments and making sure people feel connected to the mission is that this actually destroys the organization's mission, is disconnecting people from the outcome and making them care about this little siloed piece and throwing things over a wall. Because let's say I have a quota, right? I have to get this many widget tops screwed on, right? Nobody's measuring what's happening to them after that. I get paid on how I do that. I don't actually care. If I find a new way to accomplish that, I don't actually care the impact that it has on anybody else in this process. It's not my problem. That's someone else's job.
Yeah.
So how do we go from a system where I have this little piece of the job to it's my responsibility to make sure that everybody else's piece of the job also goes smoothly? See, that's the fundamental reorganization that is very tricky because people don't even understand that that is what we actually have to accomplish. We have to change the incentives in the human system because the technical problems, honestly, are pretty easy.
Yeah.
It's reorienting the human system that's hard.
Completely agree with you. You know, like we have worked on the silos, we tried to bring them together, but we really did not spend enough time on the incentive system. If you don't have incentive, as people say, like the sales guys, you know, they're coin operators. For that matter, actually, everyone is incentive operator. Incentive could be anything. Could be salary, pay, raise.
People's behavior change based on how they're measured.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you say,
Right.
but how they're measured will change their behavior. Absolutely agree, and I think that's if you measured on the outcome as a team or as an individual, I think the result is different than when you say you are measured in my siloed organization. Development is innovating, but operation is struggling because the set of bugs came in, and if you don't have code coverage, you don't have exception handling, you only tested a happy path, you didn't test the unhappy path, then what happens, right? How are you? So it is, we call it like, is the quality before you check in to your source control? That's the quality should be.
Right.
That's when DevOps becomes successful. If you check in a bug and you expect the automation and test to be discovered somewhere else, then I think it's too late.
Right, and also, tying it back to the question that was originally asked, the inertia of the large enterprise, the incentive structures and startups are fundamentally different than incentive structures at large enterprises and even small and mid-sized businesses,
Exactly.
right? So you have tied the incentives of the startup back to, the mission and the outcome of the company.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's move on. Let's talk about some of the technology trends, things that are happening, and how it will impact DevOps evolution. Let's start with AI, right? There's a lot of talk about AI ops. If there are Gartners doing their magic quadrants around that, there are companies that, like they did just ops or biz ops, they are talking about AI ops. So let's talk about how machine learning, based on all the data that these guys have collected or collecting, and artificial intelligence will change the way DevOps will evolve. Let's start with Greg.
Sure. So this is a really interesting thing to me because I think we're sort of on the cusp of the AI revolution, I think, and this will definitely drive down into DevOps and into process automation. I think someone is going to start figuring out how to get the power of that statistical correlation and the insight you can derive from that and turn that to our operations, to our DevOps environments, and figure out how do we start deriving insights into where we can further remove waste from our system. What are we doing that's not having the effect that we think it is? What are we doing that's pure waste? What are the boxes we're ticking off because they make us feel good but don't actually accomplish what we think they do? So that's really hard for humans to dig into deeply because we don't know that we've already accepted this and we don't even realize what we're not measuring. There's lots of things we do. We're very attached to things in our process, and certain concepts become deeply ingrained. And it's very difficult for us to come and realize that, our change control process is actually making us worse at managing change. And we would be better off with no change control process than the change control process that we have, which is one of the insights from Accelerate, the latest from Gene Kim, Jez Humble, and Dr. Nicole Forsgren. Really recommend that book. They found an inverse correlation between heavyweight change control process and the ability to manage change. Now, humans think the more change control elements, boxes we tick, the better we're doing, but it actually turns out to be false. Exactly the reverse of that.
Interesting.
Right? We hit a point of diminishing return and then actually negative return the more we keep adding on to this in an effort to make sure that that problem we had never happens again, right? Which may have never happened again anyway. So we bog the system down with all this overhead. So what AI can do, where I think AI can really be valuable to us, is in helping us examine parts of the system that we don't even realize we're not measuring, and turn up more insights like that, more data science insights.
So let's kind of double click on that. That's intriguing, right? Because like there's been a lot of talk about this, a lot of hype about it. But let's kind of break it down into simple terms to kind of see like which areas of software development lifecycle will have more impact, or kind of we will see AI coming in sooner than later. I mean, I could start with a couple of examples in the ops side of the world, right? The metrics that you're finding the hotspots where the problems are based on the previous failures and stuff like that. Those are some of the areas, and test automation based on where the code path where like you see more failure. Again, kind of based on that, you can come up with algorithms that can tell you like this code path will have higher probability of risk, and you need to look at that and things like that. So let's kind of talk about that. Let's like kind of come up with like simple examples that you could share with the audience here. Where do you think AI will influence and ultimately provide value to the end customers?
Yeah, so I think you touched on AI ops today is doing a lot on the ops side.
Right.
Like how do you do correlation, how do you do categorization, prioritization, hotspot. But I believe what Greg touched upon before, it can create a data-driven organization. Rather than having a process-based silos, you can see the data flows all the way from development. We talked about automation, test-driven. How do you catch all those problems as you are building your code to do analysis and start providing you intelligence to do an impact analysis? There are tools today, we have SonarQube and others to find security holes and code dependency, code complexity. But how many people are really using and taking action? What if machines start pinpointing you exactly what this recursive function could have an impact on the long term, that it will have a memory overrun when you are running with this kind of a data, because your automation test will never test with a data set that's million data that you'll hit in the production. So you can start bringing those intelligence in your flow of change to touch upon the point that you may not need a change management process because operation has come into development. So you can actually bring the operation before operation into the development, and AI could be that instrument or that mechanism to make it happen.
Great, that sounds good. Scott?
So similar, and I totally agree with that, but I also think that AI is going to help out on the financial side, right? You're going to find that it will become smart enough based on the data sets to say, hey, this function or this application or this feature that's currently riding here will be better placed over here, and that's going to save us some money in infrastructure, or that's going to save us some money in development, it's going to save us some money elsewhere. So I really think that where these data sets are completed, well, they're not going to be completed, but as these data sets evolve and have more and more data in them, that we're going to find that contributes in other aspects of the DevOps life, the financial side of it, and the running of the business side of it, where it should be anyway, but it's going to contribute more there.
Good. Do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I think they've pretty much, I think we've killed it. But I will say that I think the impact AI is going to have is completely unpredictable. As much as I'm trying to predict it, I think we are going to be, much like when containers exploded on the scene, almost no one was saying this is what's going to happen next. There's moments where the perfect thing hits at the perfect time, and lightning just strikes. And I think we're going to be very surprised, and it's going to be, it would be almost impossible to predict how the impact is going to play out. But what we can predict is that it will be profound.
So let's talk about another trend. You touched on containers, microservices, serverless. As the technologies are evolving, I have mostly worked, I started my career working on the waterfall, right? With monolith and like code that this kind of goes on forever and ever, right? And now people are kind of breaking that apart. New developments are starting with microservices. Serverless world is different. In DevOps, I come from ops side. One of the biggest challenges that I saw is how do you monitor those, right? The typical monitoring was done by putting agents in the application, doing bytecode instrumentation, putting the timers in the code, and those timers, kind of stupid, but it told you is that was that starting time, was the end time, and it told you the performance of the system, right? Serverless, it becomes different. You can't use those agents and put it in a, the function over there, or in a small microservices. So things have changed, technology as we moving in this direction. Thoughts from your side, how this trend, how this evolution to smaller asynchronous services, as we are kind of getting into IoT world, there will be a lot of asynchronous interaction between services, right? How all of this will impact the evolution of DevOps. Thoughts?
So personally, I think my personal thinking is that we don't have enough discipline around microservices architecture. We don't have enough understanding of the design principles that make microservices effective. So we're repeating some of the same mistakes and just making smaller monoliths and still doing all of the same things with them and still treating them and managing them exactly the same way. But you have to fundamentally rethink. If you want to move to, if you're having to SSH into your containers to debug them, you're already wrong. Mm-hmm. You're thinking about this all wrong, right? So I think we have to move away from this kind of internal hook monitoring to an external monitoring. Each one is a small independent function, or should be, right? Mm-hmm. So you send test data in and out, right? That your monitoring system takes the same pathways as your actual application.
Yep.
And it's functional monitoring, right? And also you have to change your view of logging, right? The logs are all thrown somewhere. If you don't have log management, you are not going to be very effective at microservices, right? You have to fundamentally rethink how you do things, and that's hard to do. That's why these things change incrementally, and that's why people hit that trough of disillusionment when they think they've figured out a way to solve all their problems, but they're just doing the same things and calling it something different. And then you're just adding complexity. You want to move from a monolith to a microservices architecture, and you're just adding a lot of complexity by putting all these interacting pieces in there, but they're all still synchronously connected. They're all still connecting to a single data source. They're all still, you're still doing all the same things, right? You're still SSHing into these individual components to see what's happening with it and monitor it. And those paradigms don't work in this world. So you have to front load your effort here to understand what you're doing, right? Start small, start learning, and gain insight and go a little at a time.
Great. Any other thoughts, guys?
I think he's exactly right with where the key point being the logging. You have to throw those logs out some places you can see them, because logging into something that's serverless, right? I mean, and looking at that, or containerized, and inspecting for errors, that's just, like you said, wrong. The fundamental principles of doing microservice design and throwing state systems out there, it's actually going back a long ways to have stateful operating systems that have no timers whatsoever. But we've got to start thinking about doing that again. And the circle goes around, and the things we did 20 years ago are now becoming relevant again.
Right.
Well, microservices to me is really, it's solid principles applied to, instead of making everything modular inside your monolithic code base, you're making them modular in the infrastructure to even further isolate effects.
Okay.
It's a separation of concerns and variables amplified by taking it out and making it a different code base. Mm-hmm. Now you can independently do surgery on components instead of having to affect everything to affect anything. So to me, that's super powerful. It's a super powerful way to think about how we're going to architect our environments.
Nice.
Yeah, I think Forrester Research, Michael Gultier came up with the no ops around 5 years ago.
Right.
I think serverless really takes you towards the nirvana. That hey, you don't need patching, you don't need detection, you don't need service, you don't need monitoring, right? Everything will be taken care. But I believe we are far from really getting into prime time enterprise application deployed. But I believe the promise of all the things that we are doing in container microservice will eventually be realized through something like serverless. Mm-hmm. We may call it by a different name, but it will be something like serverless, but it will have that when something go wrong, when the performance start degrading, when somebody is not able to access the system, how do you troubleshoot then?
Nice.
when something you have dynamically built to serve that particular service. So there will be some things, as Scott and Greg said, that we have to bring those monitoring capability, but it has to be a different form when you are running things completely no ops, basically, you don't need.
All right, so we ran out of time, but I have one last question for you guys. Let's do kind of yes, no, maybe kind of answer. Is that standardization or consortium? I worked on something called DevOps Express. 14 different vendors came together, tried to do reference architecture and standardize on some of those things that customers could benefit from. Somehow it didn't go very well. It failed. But is there a need to have a IT-like standard body for DevOps? Yes, no, maybe. Start with you, Greg.
Sure. So I think one of our primary challenges here is to balance the sharing aspect of the DevOps culture, where we're all feeding back our learnings and developing this evolving set of best practices, and not going the path of ITIL, of over-defining things to where you stultify innovation and iteration.
So you say no.
So I would say no.
Scott.
I too say no. You know, the idea being that you want your developers, your engineers to be solving new problems and introducing tools that make sense where they make sense, and introducing new ideas where they do make sense, and leveraging all that stuff to do a better job. And I think standardization squashes that.
Banu?
DevOps is a way of life, and you don't make a standardization of way of life.
Okay,
Right, so.
good point of views. Thank you, gentlemen. It was great talking to you. I'm hoping that in 5 years from now at this organization, we will do another 15 years, where to go next. So until then, enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Guys, that was very well said.
Thank you.
at the end there.